When it comes to the business of having a career in music, it's a roller coaster. And I was thinking about this when talking with my guest today, Mike Baggetta. Mike has found a way to take what he does, take his music, the way he plays, and the way he writes, and connect it to a much larger audience. And he's had wild success, if I may say. My conversation with him was really informative and inspiring. He has a new album out with Jim Keltner and Mike Watt coming out soon. He also has a band with Mike Watt and Stephen Hodges called MSSV that you can check out on the links below. Thanks for dropping by. Mike, what's on the horizon for you music-wise?
I have a brand new record coming out November 18th. It's the second record with Mike Watt and Jim Keltner. It's a follow-up to the Wall of Flowers record we put out in 2019. This record is called Every When We Go, also on the Big Ego Records label. So you'll start hearing about it October 18th. The actual release date is November 18th, and we're celebrating that release with a couple of shows in Los Angeles when the record comes out.
I remember one time you told me to be fulfilled artistically, you wanted to record as much music as you possibly could. And I wonder if do you still feel that way?
I think just like sort of if you can, well, for me, it's all I really want to do is just keep making music. So it makes sense that I would think that. Yeah, and I like recording especially because it's going to outlast all of us. I mean, hopefully, no one may listen to it, but it might be there if they want to.
Tell us a little bit about Main Steam Stop Valve.
Main Steam Stop Valve is my band with Stephen Hodges on drums and Mike Watt on bass. And that band kind of grew out of the Wall of Flowers records that me and Mike did with Jim Keltner when we wanted to do a tour. When that record came out, Jim wasn't available for travel. So Watt and I decided we'd still like to do some shows for the record, so I got in touch with Stephen Hodges, who is another one of my favorite drummers, and especially for me, the connection on that was that he plays drums on a real touchstone record for me and for this whole thing, which is Mike Watt's first opera called Contemplating the Engine Room. And that record is Watt, Stephen Hodges, and our friend Nels Cline on guitar. And when I heard that record in college, it it kind of blew my mind, but in the sense that it actually made everything come together for me, because I spent a lot of time thinking about how can you have a band and how can you write music that is inspired by all kinds of different genres without sounding like sort of a patchwork quilt of like, okay, here's our reggae song and here's our jazz song and here's our country song, and people sort of putting the mask on. Here was a record where I heard a limitless amount of genres influencing the overall arching narrative of the work, and yet it still sounded like a very distinctive band sound. So when I heard that, it was, like when nobody could run a 4-minute mile, and then, was it Prefontaine? He ran the 4-minute mile, and then everybody runs the 4-minute mile. That was kind of my like collective consciousness moment of like, oh, they did it, and then I really have been working in that vein ever since. So anyways, Hodges plays drums on that. So I wasn't trying to like recreate the band or anything. I was just thinking like, wouldn't it be cool if, Hodge agreed to do that first tour, the Wall of Flowers tour, which was coast to coast in 10 days in March 2019. And we pulled that off. And then I think halfway through we were kind of like, we're going to need a band name for the next one. And the actual band name was Watt's suggestion, Main Steam Stop Valve. Part of the narrative structure of Contemplating the Engine Room is influenced by a book called The Sand Pebbles. And that book is, it's about a seafaring crew and a lot of life lessons. But one of the moments in the movie version with Steve McQueen of the book, one of the main characters is talking about the main steam stop valve, and that is part of the ship that kind of keeps the whole thing rolling. That's the Cliff Notes version.
Oh, cool.
So anyways, there's this whole cyclical kind of like connective thing about it, which is really cool.
Right. I take it you didn't really know these guys before. How did you did you just call them up? How did this come to be?
This is another funny story because I'd always thought, like well into my 30s, I just always thought that every great band I'd heard or every great record was like obviously made up of lifelong friends. That sort of, nobody really told me that wasn't
Right.
that it wasn't possible to do it the
Yeah.
other way. Like my dad had a band when I was a little kid and they were all friends forever, and I've always made records with, like I've made a record, your record, which is great, Woebegone, that was such a great band.
Yeah.
So like just recording with people you're friends with, and my other projects before this were just people I knew and played with a bunch. So, and I think I listened to records and gone to hear bands where I knew they didn't know each other. They were just like some dude hired a bunch of other dudes. And I was always left feeling like, that was kind of whatever. So just in my mind, I was like, yeah, if you really want to make great music, you can only do it with your friends. So that was the story, right? And that was fine. It's totally cool. And then so I had a conversation with an older friend of mine, a great, amazing musician named David Torn, and what I believe is his first record for the ECM label. It's called Cloud About Mercury, and that's another like big touchstone record for me. Listening to that album, it's like the music is incredible and like really genre defying and boundary pushing and just really beautiful music too. And so I listened to that album forever and just assumed, there he is with all his lifelong friends making this amazing record. Yeah, because how else could you make an album that sounds this good if you didn't know these people? It didn't make sense to me, Like it's a pretty intimate relationship to make great music. How could you do it with a stranger? But so anyways, I was talking to him one day about something, and I think I asked him about the record, and he was like, oh yeah, I cold called all those guys. Like he didn't know any of them. Remember, I'm like 34 or something. I'm just like, oh, what? I didn't really know that it was possible. So it's another moment of me thinking like, yeah, this is possible and this isn't possible, and then having that perception twisted by actual knowledge. So he told me that, and I was like, what? You didn't know any of those guys? He's like, no, I think he said he like wrote Bill Bruford a letter and like mailed it to the UK or whatever. But anyway, so in my mind I was like, oh, okay, so I've been wrong my whole life. So you could possibly, if a lot of other details are in alignment, you could make a great record with people you don't know. So fast forward a little bit, my friend Chris Schlarb in Long Beach, California, he's starting a studio and a record label called Big Ego, and he asked me if I'd want to do a record. And I said, okay, but I want to do something I've never done before. I want to try this idea of seeing what would happen if I try to make a record with people I've never met. And he said, okay, well, what are you thinking? And in my mind, I was like, wouldn't it be cool if I could hear Jim Keltner and Mike Watt play together? Just for my own personal, selfishness. Like no one's ever had them record together, and I always heard similarities in sort of their approach to playing in or as a rhythm section, and I thought it would be a really cool, my participation was pretty much incidental in my mind, and so so Chris Schlarb, he really worked to kind of make the stars align, and we found a date to do that, and we made the Wall of Flowers record. And then so Watt and Keltner had never met before that day, and I'd never met either of them, so we met in the studio. And then when we were going to do the tour with Hodges, obviously he and Watt knew each other, but I'd never met Steven. And I was living in Knoxville, Tennessee at the time, and Hodge was playing in Chattanooga with Mavis Staples when he was in that band. So I went down there, and we hung out for a day. I think he wanted to make sure I wasn't an axe murderer or something, and we got along, and so that was that.
So when Wall of Flowers came out, I feel like that something happened there musically, that it started to connect with a larger audience outside of jazz audience. Do you feel that way, or?
Well, my intention was never so much about the audience, but I do think I had a different intention with sort of like the center of the music. Like, you know, I lived here in New York City for a really long time, and kind of our ilk is more or less sort of this sort of like modern jazz-ish, improvised music, sort of some genre stretching kinds of things. But more often than not, when you play instrumental music, regardless of what it is, the greater population just sort of thinks jazz, which is totally great, and that's an awesome history. But it also has a limiting factor in sort of the greater mind of the population, I think, where maybe they think it's sort of like an inaccessible music, or it's kind of high-minded, or a lot of things that I don't like about thinking about music. I don't want music to be inaccessible or necessarily high-minded. I mean, it can be, but I think it has to relate to people, and it has to touch people, and it has to move people, and if that makes them want to move or think or rebel against it and tell everybody how terrible it is, like at least that's a feeling that they're having, you know, which I'm definitely have made that happen a few times. But yeah, I mean, that was kind of just, that's always been my intention, but it's always been difficult when you are kind of, it's difficult to kind of have that connection with people when it's hard for them to get past like a barrier of entry, no matter how subconscious it is.
Man, that's really well said.
Well, I don't know, but I'm trying to get to that point. I don't really know how to say it yet, but anyways, it wasn't like there wasn't any active move about the record. Like, all right, here's how I get out of the jazz ghetto. Here's you know, not really. I mean, it was just sort of like, you know how sometimes people that come from an improvised music or jazz music background, they'll try to have people from other types of musical backgrounds improvise and see what happens. Mm-hmm. And it happens a lot in classical music. It's happened with rock music and stuff sometimes. It was just kind of this idea of like, what if I have my music played by, try to play my music with a couple of people who are like master musicians that have done all kinds of music for decades and decades and decades. What can I learn from them by doing that? That was kind of all I wanted to do. But I wanted to make sure that I brought things in my playing or in my songs that would allow that to happen.
Right. Do you think leaving New York opened you up to these kind of possibilities musically?
What happened to me, and I don't think it's an uncommon story, like I lived here almost 15 years, and you know, I met a lot of great people, had a lot of really great times, made a lot of great music, and learned like an invaluable amount of stuff. But towards the last couple of years I was living here, it was like I was working so much to pay my rent and not having a lot of time to actually work on my music. And I was so tired at the end of the day. Right. It was like even going out to hear all the great music that happens all the time was really difficult, because I'd have to get up really early and do all this work to afford to keep living here so that I could keep, you know, it was like the hamster wheel thing. And after like a couple years, I wised up and I was like, you know, what I really need to do in this life is work on my music. And there's all kinds of ways that you can do that, and there's all kinds of situations people get into, but for me it was just hard to do at that point in that way. Yeah, I knew some people down in Knoxville, Tennessee, so I checked it out. I ended up moving down there, and it was much more affordable. So in that way, I was able to kind of save up a little bit of money to make that Wall of Flowers record. Because you see, I'd made a bunch of records for a label in Spain, in Barcelona, called Fresh Sound, yep, which you're also on. And a lot of great musicians are on that label. And like for me coming up, I listened to a bunch of records on that label. So when I was able to put my own music on there and have Jordy like kind of believe in me enough to make the records, it was like really awesome, you know. So for me, being able to live in a more affordable place where you actually have a little bit of space to, you know, maybe you don't have to pack up the computer to pull the bed out at night every time, you know, like things can be set up to do work, and to have a little bit more free time, you know, a few hours a day to focus on that, where you're not like being run ragged to try to do whatever to make the rent, you know. Allowed me that. So in both of those ways, like financially and mentally, it did actually help me make that record.
Yeah. So I'd like to talk a little bit about how you go about booking all the shows that you book.
MSSV did we had planned a tour in spring 2020. We all know how that ended up. So
Huge success.
Yeah, so we postponed that until we could get it together again. So it ended up being spring 2022. We called it the Haru Tour 2022. Haru is spring in Japanese. And it was 48 shows in 48 days. We started in Southern California, and we went counterclockwise around, more or less, around the United States, California again.
So, and you're booking all the venues.
That one I booked everything except maybe a couple of spots. I had a little help from Watt.
Do you have how do you just keep it straight? Do you have spreadsheets and
For stuff like that, I actually just have a notebook and
okay.
or Post-it notes and stuff, but I just write everything down. But yeah, I just keep track of who I've been in touch with and what I've got to send them and when I've got to email them, and I make, there's like a map of the country, and so I just sort of figured out okay, what's next in line, where can we go from here that's not like a crazy drive, although we did have a couple of crazy drives. So
my experience is for every one gig, there's maybe 5 venues that either ignore you or aren't available.
I mean, I sent out hundreds and hundreds of emails.
Wow.
Yeah. And sometimes you don't get a response after a couple of emails, so you get the message and you move on. Or sometimes they can't make it work, with just sort of the budget thing you might have in mind, or they could do it, but can you do it on the next day? And you can't do it on the next day because you got to get to this other place that you've already got down. So there's all these little hiccups that happen along the way, but I just do a little bit every day when I'm planning something.
Yeah, was it
chip away
an hour a day?
It's not every day, but it's probably a couple of hours when I do it.
Wow. All right.
But if
that seems reasonable, actually.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it is. But also this one, for spring of 2020, I probably started to plan it in the middle of, maybe towards the end of 2019, when you could plan stuff 6 to 8 months out. And then after COVID, a lot of other bands had the same idea. So I was now booking for 2022 in the spring. I was booking it in spring of 21. I was starting a year out. And there were still some places that were difficult to do because all the dates had been taken up already. So now, the next MSSV record we recorded on days 49 and 50, right after the tour, that's going to come out in fall of 23. So I'm looking towards we're looking towards doing another U.S. tour then, if everything aligns that needs to align. So I'll probably be starting that pretty soon if it's going to happen.
Do you feel like you have some wind at your sails?
It's easier to get a reply because we've played at the places before. And so if you have a good show at a place and you want to do it again, it's pretty likely that won't be too difficult. So it's just about kind of lining up days and making sure we're all on the same page with everything.
Well, it sounds like you have a pretty zen approach to booking. I admire that.
I've gotten a lot of disinterest in my life. so I'm used to, if people don't want to book me or my groups or my music, it's not really news to me.
Right.
It's just sort of I'll just try somewhere else. Who knows what the considerations are? I mean, these are businesses that have to pay rent, and they probably have exorbitant overhead costs, and they've got a million bands asking to play at their place, some of which they like, some of which they don't, and they've got all these who knows what their considerations are. I think it's easy for musicians to take a rejection and be how could you not appreciate all of the hours I've spent crafting my vision into the people sometimes don't care,
Yeah.
It's okay.
Yeah.
It's okay.
So you have an album with Viktor Krauss coming out, I think?
Yeah.
Right?
Eventually, yep.
Yeah, eventually.
Yeah, that's going to be on the Destiny Records label.
How did you connect with him?
I was living in Knoxville, Tennessee, East Tennessee, and it's probably 2.5 hours east of Nashville. So I would go out to Nashville a bunch, and I have some friends that are great musicians out there that I would meet up and play with. And there's a great drummer out there named Josh Hunt. he's an awesome drummer, and I think at one point he had connected me with Viktor. We did a trio gig. Maybe we did 2 trio gigs. Josh, was it 2? I don't remember. But that was really fun. And then I thought, you know, I've had a lot of bands with drums in them, like duh, right? You know, but the more I play, or the more projects I do, the more I'm interested in kind of trying to do things that I find are going to be really challenging, or things that I think are going to be hard for me, because I love playing with great bassists, of course, and I love playing with great drummers, but I wonder if sometimes I like it because it makes it easier for me somehow, like subliminally, like, man, if you have a great rhythm section, you almost don't have to play.
That's right. Yeah, right.
Right?
Yeah.
And so sometimes I don't. But I wonder, like what would happen if the drums were gone? How would I feel? And I remember thinking about that a lot. And of course, it's like really easy to play with Viktor, so I don't even know if that answered the question. But it was kind of a little attempt for me to see what would happen without drums with some of my music.
Yeah.
I think the album is half originals and half covers.
Cool.
So we'll see. It's had some production delays, but hopefully it'll be out early 2023.
Well, you play a tune on there, a Patsy Cline tune, Strange. It's beautiful. I can't wait for it to come out. I want to hear the whole album. Do you want to try playing it?
Yeah, sure.
All right.
Yeah.
Pretty. Is there anything you're not doing right now that you would like, oh, I wish I was doing
Oh,
this?
actually, yeah, there is. That I actually sort of just was thinking about on this little string of shows I've been doing up the East Coast. I would love to be able to figure out how to do a great solo concert and a great solo album.
Oh, I'd like to hear that too.
Well, I have no idea. I kind of maybe started to have a little inkling of what it might be. I did a little solo spot, like a 12-minute spot on a radio show out of Oxford, Mississippi called Thacker Mountain Radio a week ago. And it was really fun. And I played two of my songs from the upcoming Everywhere We Go record, the title track, Everywhere We Go, and I think it's the closing track on the record called Measure of a Life. And figuring out how to play those by myself without any accompaniment, you know, I've always known solo playing is really challenging, and I've done some of it before, and it's always kind of left me kind of like disinterested. Like, one thing I really love about music is interacting with the people I'm playing with. That's like the one huge attraction of it for me. But the more I kind of do things, the more I think like there might be a really good way to get to the point faster in a solo setting. And I started to kind of see how that might work for me and my music in that little 10-12 minute thing that I prepared. I just feel like the solo unaccompanied playing, it's really hard to get right for me, for my own aesthetic taste, obviously, is all I'm talking about. And I've heard a few things that do really hit the mark on the head that are kind of inspiring, but more importantly, I've got to figure out how to process that for myself. So that's kind of a big goal. I don't know if I'll ever do it, but I hope to be able to.
More tune? Lonely Woman?
Okay.
Ornette Coleman?
Sure.
My guest has been Mike Baggetta. Mike, thanks so much for coming by.
Thanks for having me.
Hope you enjoy. Thanks, have a great day. If you like what you heard today, please feel free to reach out and say hello. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe. It will help me make more videos like this in the future. Thanks.